Before Bob Clearmountain, there was no such thing as a specialist mix engineer. Usually the engineers and producers that made the records would pretty much mix as they went along. Back in the 60s and early 70s, there just weren't as many options as how to affect the sound. It was largely make the sound and put it onto tape. Starting at Media Sound Studios in New York in the early 70s, Bob cut his teeth in the industry of being the assistant engineer mainly for TV and radio jingles, but he was also around such greats as Duke Ellington and Stevie Wonder. Stevie was recording Innovisions during the night sessions, and Bob asked if he could sit in and observe. Despite having to be up early in the morning to start the session he was actually assigned to. This dedication saw him blossom, moving on to engineer Kool and the Gang, Sister Sledge and Bruce Springsteen, who he would continue to work with for many years. As his reputation grew, he was hired as the chief engineer at Tony Bon Jovi's newly opened Power Station Studios in 1977. He helped design and equip the studio to offer the best facility around. One of the first bands to make a name for the place was Chic. A young Nile Rodgers learnt a lot from Bob that he would later use in his own productions. One such technique was using one instrument to key another to create a more intricate rhythm pattern. In the song Everybody Dance, Bob got Nile to play a funky rhythm pattern to trigger the notes of a clavinet that was playing straight whole notes, then combine the two. Nile was completely amazed by this. When Power Station was being set up, Bob scoured the building for suitable echo chambers. For large reverbs, he used a stairwell which had a reverb time of around 4 to 5 seconds, depending on whether it was raining. Apparently with humidity in the air, the reverb was a whole second longer, so naturally he liked to mix ballads on a rainy day. For tighter natural room ambience, he found a ladies' toilet that fit the bill. This was used for the background vocals on La Freak for the Africa bit. This was also extenuated by saturating the signal to add a little distortion and urgency to the tone. The success of Chic boosted Clearmountain's reputation and led to a contact from the Rolling Stones, who needed some help making a 12-inch dance hit of their song Miss You. This collaboration also led to continued relationship with Mick and the Stones, and led to Bob mixing their 1981 album Tattoo You and the classic Start Me Up single. And by now saw Bob mixing it with the cream of rock royalty, no pun intended. It was at this time that he became extremely sought after and received a call from Roxy Music to engineer and mix their new album Avalon. Released in 1982, Avalon became a benchmark for quality with listeners and also other engineers and professionals. This record was impressive for its width and depth that was achieved through a clever use of ambience and delay effects, not to mention a whole load of taste. His influence on the records he mixed was clear. Also, his mark was left with other up-and-coming mixing engineers like Tom and Crystal Adalgi and Jack Joseph Puig. It wasn't just his techniques that were being studied, but his equipment choices were also heavily influencing other studios and engineers. The popularity of the Yamaha NS10 speaker as a reference monitor can be traced to Bob. He wanted to have something very run-of-the-mill and frankly a bit nasty to test mixes on, that were a bit more extended than the classic Auratones that had previously been used as a staple for this purpose. Enter the Yamaha NS10, the affordable bookshelf speaker of the masses. It seemed bizarre to think that it could have been any other random speaker he chose at the time. In that way, studios all around the world would look a bit different, including mine. The sonic expanse of Avalon saw Clearmountain utilise the latest technology to its fullest. The eventide phasers and flanges, the harmonizer, AMS digital delays, and of course his own reverb chambers were all working harmoniously to create the spaces and textures he heard in his head. Although some of his effects workflow could be said to be technical in nature, he is adamant it's never a good idea to get too technical and precious about gear. Instead, allowing yourself to listen to the song and use your intuition and taste to guide you to what's needed. To this day, Bob still uses the Pultec style EQs and Uri 1178s for drums and guitars that he's been using for decades, with the maxim being if it ain't broke, then don't fix it. Other classic gear he still uses to this day are the Uri LA3A for transparent vocal compression. His philosophy is to mix pretty quickly, and with the faders up, never spending too much time soloing individual tracks. Context is key in mixing, and the world's best sounding snare on its own might sound horrible in context with a particular mix, so why bother listening to it like that? The next top draw artist he worked with was David Bowie. Bowie had enjoyed undeniable acclaim as an artist up until this point, but big hits had been few and far between for him by the early 80s. The 1983 Let's Dance album reversed that trend with the A-team of producer Nile Rodgers and Clearmountain on engineering duties, not to mention a fairly unknown guitarist by the name of Stevie Ray Vaughan thrown into the mix. Let's Dance was a huge success, and Power Station's Chamber 1 featured again, with regenerative tape delays with delay outputs also feeding the chamber. The snare sound is also notable for featuring a gated plate reverb. The gated reverb technique was now in its full 80s pomp by this stage. By choking the large reverb tail, it kept its hugeness but also allowed space in the mix for it to sit. Another notable track to feature the power station stairwell was Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen. The massive snare drum is completely synonymous with this period and was egged on by Bruce himself. Bob was asked to make the drum sound huge, and without doubt Bob achieved this directive emphatically. It's very distinctive, and some people loved it and some people hated it. Bob recalled one producer telling his artist not to use him, saying, "Don't get that guy to mix it, he'll have that horrible Born in the USA snare sound all over it." Taste aside, it's evident that these sounds define a whole era. The use of drum replacement samples became popular due to engineers like Clearmountain also. Recordings could effectively be saved by mixing in samples of great kicks and snares and blending those into the mix. This helped give the dedicated mix engineers a signature sought-after sound. Bob wasn't to be confined to this era and genre though, and continued to mix for top-name artists including The Cure, INXS, Tears for Fears, Bryan Adams and Crowded House, just to name a few. Bob now works from his home studio, still using his beloved SSL 4000G Plus console, an extensive collection of vintage outboard. Although he hasn't converted to working in the box, he does use some plugins, mostly his own developed with Apogee. These include Clearmountain's Domain and Spacers, that combine a lot of outboard gear he uses for ambient effects, meaning you can play around with those reverbs that he used to make all those classic hits. You may not want to have them quite as wet in your mix for today's taste, but the effects themselves that use a series of processors to achieve the sounds can be dialed in with ease. For example, his chain for delays can include a pitch shifting modulation for lush evolving textures, coupled with de-essers for smoothing out the delay returns. It's worth checking out when they're on sale, I think, but certainly as a demo to understand the signal flow if you'd like to try something similar with other plugins. Having mixed the Taylor Hawkins tribute concert, Bob Clearmountain is still very much in the game and shows no sign of hanging up his faders just yet. His career has helped develop what we know a mixing engineer to be, and for that, I would say he was a true legend.